Hello, everybody. It's about 6:51 as I'm starting this, and the stream is starting about 9 minutes early. So just sit tight for about 9 minutes. We're going to start the study at 7, and we're going to be doing Exodus 3 and 4 today. I wonder how noisy the fan is.
Stop.
Okay.
Thanks.
So it got pretty windy today.
Yeah, when I left work, I was like, "Oh, Jeff, there's a whole lot of trash right outside our door."
Yeah, branches were whipping. Five more minutes. So I think this evening I'm going to go upstairs and figure out how much darkroom paper I have left.
Mhm. Mom, time.
Hello. I haven't looked at those negatives since they dried, or since I set them out to dry. I want to know how much paper I have so I can figure out if I can only print one of them or if I could do a test of both. I guess it would only be one more piece of paper.
Waiting.
I also think I might make pancakes later.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That would be a brilliant idea.
I heard we have ice cream.
We'll find. We'll just have ice cream then. I'm gonna have pancakes at least once this week, though.
Okay. It is a little warm.
Oh, we have to bake your cake tomorrow.
We have to clean the pan out.
I mean, it should be pretty easy. It's never been used.
Well, the paper.
It's still stuck on. Yeah. So we'll have to watch it. Yeah.
It's been on there for
1 million years.
probably 20 years.
That long?
Daddy says evening.
Hello.
It's so exciting.
Huh?
It's so exciting.
I mean, I've been a boring person for a long time. I can't get any more exciting than this.
More
Yeah, this is as exciting as I get. Would you turn on that light?
Yep.
Thank you.
Is there a camera there?
Yeah.
I was trying to remember what was there, and I was like, was it a camera?
Yeah, there was a camera there. I put it in the bag. Put it somewhere else.
Your mom says you're not boring, and I'm totally unbiased.
Yeah. All right. It is 7 o'clock. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so today we are in Exodus 3 and 4. We're not going to go into 5. At least I don't think we are. Because that's a different sort of phase of the story.
Also, because 6 technically is in the paragraph of the end of 5.
Yeah.
Makes it confusing.
So, Exodus chapter 3. This is continuing the story of Moses. Now, when last we left Moses, he had wandered off to Midian. Midian is in the Arabian Peninsula, not in Egypt proper, right? So, geographically, very different place. And he went there because he had murdered an Egyptian man, and it was found out. And Pharaoh had decided that he wanted to kill Moses, so Moses had to beat feet and run away. He ends up rescuing some shepherd girls, I guess, and their father goes and says, "What the heck did you leave him alone for? You don't meet a guy like that, bring him home," right? So he goes over and ends up married to a Midianite woman named Zipporah, and his father-in-law ends up being this guy named Jethro. And that chapter ends with I'll just start in verse 23 of chapter 2. After a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned because of their difficult labor, and they cried out, and their cry for help ascended to God because of the difficult labor. So God heard their groaning. He remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the Israelites, and he took notice. Okay, so we have the covenant mentioned again. That's something to remember. Well, we'll get into that, but that statement, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right, and the covenant, that's going to come back up later. So where Moses is now, he's Indian, and he's the son-in-law of this guy named Jethro. So this guy named Jethro actually has 3 different names in the Bible. One of them is Jethro, one of them is Hobab, and I don't remember the third one. And somebody might chime in with that, or we'll come to it when we come to it. And that has caused a little bit of consternation for some people reading, because they're wondering, like, really? This guy has 3 names? How can that be, right? But one possibility is that Jethro was actually a title rather than a proper name.
Can I back up and ask a question?
You can back up and ask a question.
Okay. In verse 24, and he remembered his covenant.
Yeah.
I feel like I've heard a lot of places where people are like, well, God forgets things, but it doesn't really mean what we think it means. Right?
Exactly. It doesn't mean at all what we think it means. I wonder who says God forgets things. There are things where there are occasions in the Bible where God says, I will remember such and such no more. I don't think that means that it slipped his mind. I think it means that he chooses not to regard it. Mm-hmm. But in this case, we're talking about the covenant that he made with originally Abraham. Way back, it was stated to Abraham at least 3 times that I can think of, in Genesis 12, 15, and 17. And the covenant was, I'm going to be your God. I'm going to make nations come from you. You're going to be my people. And part of that covenant was circumcision. That was the physical, in the flesh sign that somebody was part of the covenant. Remember that, because that's going to become important in chapter 4.
Do you think it was also just more of, because I know in a foreshadowing, so it's all like wibbly wobbly.
Mm-hmm.
So like later, much later, maybe even Numbers, like the people are complaining about how awesome they had it in Egypt, even though they were slaves.
Yeah.
So I imagine there had to have been times when they were in Egypt that it wasn't that bad.
Right. So we actually covered that last week in chapters 1 and 2. For a time, the Israelites lived with the Egyptians as neighbors. It was only later in their time there that they became oppressed and enslaved, right? But also, the context for a lot of their complaints that come later on in Exodus and Numbers is that they're whiny.
Yes. Okay, so Dad says when God forgets sins, he no longer holds one accountable.
Right.
And then Amanda says hi from Joel and Amanda.
Hello. I like that phrasing. No longer holds one accountable, because it's God who has perfect knowledge of everything. Forget for him doesn't that can't be the exact same verb as it means for us, right? Okay. All right. Did we read 3 verse 1?
I don't know, but start back over.
We're going to start back over again.
That said, sorry. In the Lexham translation, into verse 24 is, and God took notice.
Yeah. So, took notice, remember, the sort of foreshadowing there is that God is going to be faithful to the covenant that he made, right? And that's going to come up later.
So there's another thing. So your mom said, so does he forget when we accept Christ?
Forget what? Forget our sin? Yeah. I mean, it's when we accept Christ, we are choosing to accept the atonement for sin that we had committed. He is choosing to account to us, instead of our sin, the righteousness of Christ. We'll actually get into that more in Romans. That's a Sunday thing. Okay, so 3, verse 1. Meanwhile, Moses was shepherding the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. That's also going to come. There's so many things that are going to pop up later. Jethro, the priest of Midian. Wait, like priest of God? Yes. In fact, these people were ones that worshipped God, the same God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? And that makes you scratch your head and go, well, what the heck were they doing in Midian, right? Well, remember, okay, Abraham had a son, Isaac, right? Isaac had 2 sons, Jacob, who became the father of the Israelites, and Esau, who also became the father of nations, right? One of those nations, the Midianites, of whom apparently Jethro is a member, at least at this time, those people still worshiped the same God. Now, this causes problems for some critics, right? Because some critics point at this and go, oh, see, Midianites. So Moses is just going to take the religion of the Midianites and bring it to a bunch of Egyptian slaves who didn't worship the same God before. That's the argument that they'll make. As if there's no other way to go, well, wait a minute, why wouldn't the offspring of Abraham worship the same God as Abraham? As if somehow the idea that some of Abraham's extended relatives still worshiped the same God, that would somehow flip the tables on the whole thing. Like, that's way overstating anything that you might read about that, right? But it comes from, well, it comes from stuff that we're going to read later.
And then with Jethro being a priest, his daughters would have known things about the temple more than...
Well, remember, there is no temple, but they would have understood some stuff. And that's going to come up the next chapter, about midway through.
Oh.
Promise.
I
Okay. All right. So he leads the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of the Lord. Now, this begs the question, the mountain of the Lord, where is the mountain of the Lord? Because it's not in Midian. It's not in Egypt either.
Probably doesn't matter, the mountain of God.
The mountain of God, the mountain of the Lord, there's multiple ways of translating it, right? Horeb means a desolate place or the wilderness, right? It's not clear at all if the mountain was named for the area or if the area was named for the mountain, right? And it says the far side of Horeb. Certain Bibles will actually say to the west, the far side of Midian. Other translations will say to the west of Midian, right? So somewhere between like the Arabian Peninsula and Egypt. So in Midian, to the north, you have Canaan. To the south, you have basically nothing. It's desert. And then, well, that and the Red Sea, right? To the east, well, that's like the land of what becomes Babylon, right? The Mesopotamians. West is kind of the wilderness between Egypt and Canaan, right? And this becomes important for people who are trying to figure out somewhat futilely where the specific location for the mountain of God is. And there are lots of theories on that. And there are lots of good arguments for and against lots of those theories. Does it matter theologically? No, not really. I mean, it's the mountain of God. Finding it specifically doesn't either destroy or prove anyone's theology. All right. 2, then the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire within a bush. As Moses looked, he saw that the bush was on fire but was not consumed. So Moses thought, I must go over and look at this remarkable sight. Why isn't the bush burning? When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called out to him from the bush, Moses, Moses, here I am. Do not come closer, he said. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Okay.
Because he don't know nothing about nothing.
Because he don't know nothing about nothing. Now, this is also going to be important later. Moses was raised by the Egyptians, right? He was a Hebrew, but when he was weaned, he was given to Pharaoh's daughter, raised in the Pharaoh's house. he doesn't know anything about being a Hebrew apart from what he would have learned about God from having Jethro as his father-in-law, right? But he doesn't know what's going on here. Now, there's another thing that was slipped in there, and you might have missed it. Who's in the bush?
The angel of the Lord.
And
I don't know.
so,
And, fake fire.
so the angel of the Lord is there, but also it's the Lord who speaks to him. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
As in, he's described both as God, using the name of God that we're going to see later in the book, but also as the angel of the Lord, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is very much like what happened when Jacob describes wrestling with the angel of the Lord. So this was something that happened back in Genesis toward the end of Jacob's life. He's blessing his children, and as part of his blessing, he talks about God and the angel of God, and then he mixes them as the same person. Make sense? So exactly like we have in the Christian Trinity, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, right? They had a similar idea. They called it the two powers in heaven, where the angel of the Lord was understood to be the physical, human-shaped manifestation of God in heaven. So you have both of them in this episode, the angel of the Lord and the Lord. Now, that was perfectly acceptable Jewish theology until the 2nd century. Because by then, the Christians were going, see, look, it's a Godhead. And Jewish theologians said, nope, time out. That's not okay anymore. We don't believe that anymore. Well, for other reasons, I'm sure as well. Anyway, the point is, there's some of both, right? The presence of God as a undefinable God from heaven, but also the presence of God, the manifested, human-shaped angel of the Lord.
But that's it. So Moses' mother was hired as his nurse. So
Yes.
that might be how he would have learned.
Well, he was nursed by his mother until weaned. And then he was given, the point is there's no way to know from the text what Moses would have known about the covenant. And as we've said a couple times now, this is going to become a problem later. So, all right, verse 5, I'll just start there again. Do not come closer, he said. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he continued, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. This is another issue where, like, there had to be some kind of physical presence there, right? Because if there's just a fire, why would Moses be afraid to look at a fire? He had to have understood that the angel of the Lord was also the Lord, because he wouldn't be afraid to look at the invisible presence of God.
Yeah.
Right? Then the Lord said, oh, I almost missed it. Remember that thing, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? And we had that at the end of chapter 2. He remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's like a marker saying, hey, covenant stuff is going to happen, right? Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people in Egypt, and have heard them crying out because of their oppressors, and I know about their sufferings. I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians and to bring them from that land to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the territory of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Hey, isn't that the same wording that God used with Abraham when he called Abraham to Canaan?
Sure.
He's using the same words of the covenant. Look, it's another flag. Hey, there's going to be covenant stuff here. The Israelites' cry for help has come to me, and I have also seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. Therefore, I am sending you to Pharaoh so that you may lead my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses asked God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? And what should I bring? And I'm sorry, that I should bring the Israelites out of Egypt. He answered, I will certainly be with you, and this will be the sign to you that I have sent you. When you bring the people out of Egypt, you will all worship God at this mountain. Then Moses asked God, if I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What should I tell them? Now, this causes all kinds of problems because people ask the question, well, how come Moses didn't know God's name? Well, we've kind of said that. I mean, he was raised by Egyptians, right? The fact that he doesn't know God's name wouldn't necessarily, that's not necessarily a problem. It's perfectly reasonable to think that he wouldn't know God's name. And it's unreasonable to think that he already knew God's name and was asking the question to test God, right? Because people can lie. Anyway, God replied to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say this to the Israelites. Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever. This is how I am to be remembered in every generation. Okay, so the I am name, right? That has more than one way you can read the meaning of it, right? There is archaeological evidence that that name was used in a couple of places in Midian round about the same time as the Exodus, right? So that would seem to affirm that some people in Midian were still worshiping God. But in Midianite, it means he blows, like the one who blows, like the storm god, like the God that lives on the mountain. Hey, they're at a place called the Mountain of God, right? In Northwest Semitic, the language that the Hebrews spoke, it means to be, like I am, exactly as it says here. But it could also be read in the third person as a third person verb, because remember, the vowel pointings came way later. And it's the vowel pointings that help you determine exactly how to interpret a word. And if it's not a first person, I am, if it's read as a third person, it's I'm the one who causes to be. Make sense? So the name of God could at the same time be read as I'm the self-existing one, I am who I am, but it could also be interpreted as I'm the creator, I'm the one that causes things to be. Make sense?
Possibly.
Okay. There's argument about that.
Amanda said that she thinks it's kind of a respect thing, like he wants to represent correctly. Thinking with Moses.
About asking for the name?
Well, no, like, I think more of like the why me thing, I guess.
Oh, Moses is trying to get out of this. Moses is actually going to give multiple excuses, and eventually God's going to have enough of him. So he's looking for any out he can find.
Which is kind of funny for the way that Moses turns into and being frustrated with everybody else.
Yes, there is heavy irony there. Okay. 16. Go and assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has appeared to me and said, I have paid close attention to you and what has been done to you in Egypt. And I have promised you that I will bring you up from the misery of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. There we have that same thing repeated again. They will listen to what you say. Then you, along with the elders of Israel, must go to the king and say to him, Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Now please let us go on a 3-day trip into the wilderness so that we may sacrifice to Yahweh our God. Now that 3-day trip thing, that causes problems with people as well, right? Because that would seem to suggest that the mountain of God, where they're going to do the sacrificing, that's what he said, that's 3 days away from wherever Pharaoh is, right? Except, how long does it take them to actually get there? Way more than 3 days.
Yeah.
So what's going on here? It's a mystery. That's what's going on here.
Okay. So 2 things. Probably the easy one. Amanda
Yeah.
says, big difference from Isaiah, who shall I send, and here I am, send me.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing, which is probably maybe not today or ever,
Yeah.
it's one of those. So God says, I'm going to give you guys the land of all these other people.
Yeah.
And they're going to end up being commanded to like just slaughter all of them. And that just doesn't make any sense and seems so unfair.
It's almost like there has to be some explanation for why God wants to displace those people, right?
I guess.
It's almost like there's some reason that those people in particular are ones that God wants to remove, right?
Yeah.
We'll get there. I promise. But you're right. There is a reason for it, right?
Yeah.
And there's some hints when we get there. Things that would have been picked up by people that understood this. All right. Anyway, 19. However, I know that the king of Egypt will not allow you to go unless he is forced by a strong hand. I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my miracles, so that I will, all my miracles that I will perform in it. After that, he will let you go. And I will give these people such favor in the sight of the Egyptians that when you go, you will not go empty-handed. Each woman will ask her neighbor and any woman staying in her house for silver and gold jewelry and clothing, and so you will put them on your sons and daughters, so you will plunder the Egyptians. Okay, so that's, in a nutshell, how this part of the Exodus is going to go, right? This is going to get restated a couple of times before it actually happens. Okay, so far, as it stands, God comes to Moses, hey, Moses, I'm about to finish this whole captivity in Egypt thing. Y'all are going to go to the right people, talk to the elders, get everybody ready to go. Well, who am I going to tell them you are? I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I am, or I'm the one who causes to be, right? That guy, that's how you'll know me, right? And he says they'll all respond. Mm-hmm. They'll all agree, right? This is actually kind of an interesting thing because he's specifically using language that calls back the covenant, right? Well, Abraham believed God before any of the covenant was fulfilled, right? So God promised Abraham, I'm going to do these things for you. Before any of that actually happened, you have that very pivotal sentence where it says, Abraham believed God, and God credited it to him as righteousness, right? So the same thing is going to happen here. Before any Exodus happens, the Israelites are going to believe that God will do this, right? That's kind of interesting, isn't it? It's almost like they're saved by faith.
That says, back to the Lord in the text, the vowel pointing are from the word of Adonai.
Yes. Okay. So the consonants, YHWH, the name of God, right? The vowel pointings didn't come into the language for a long time. So the pointings for the word Adonai got put in between the consonants, YHWH or YHVH, to make that word that later got transliterated 1,500-ish years later as Jehovah, right? That practice started in the Second Temple period. So the Masoretic text, the Old Testament in Hebrew, that text uses the Adonai voweling on the consonants YHVH or YHWH, right? But that text is at least 1,000 or 1,200 years later than this, right? So, or that practice of using other vowelings because they didn't want to say the name of the Lord. So that does kind of lead to a question. At some point in the Second Temple period, they decided we can't say the name of God. That would be blasphemous. And they started this practice. Before then, because there aren't any texts from that period, because the Dead Sea Scrolls, round about, I think, 200 or 300 BC, are the oldest surviving texts, we don't actually know how they would have written this before the Second Temple period and how they specifically would have voweled it. There are some Hebrew complete Bibles. Specifically, there's the Codex Aleppo and the Codex Leningrad, that neither one of them uses the Adonai voweling for this. But it's important to understand that because that's where we get the word Jehovah. Because roundabout like 11 or 1200 AD, in the Christian church, somebody transliterated YHWH with the Adonai vowel pointings as Jehovah for European Christians to use as the name of God. So if somebody comes and tells you God's real name is Jehovah, no, that is at best like 2,000 years later imposed on that. And it's a transliteration at best. Okay. Chapter 4.
Yeah.
Where a bunch of stuff is going to happen.
Yeah.
All right. 4. Then Moses answered, "What if they won't believe me and will not obey me, but say, 'The Lord did not appear to you'?" He's still trying to get out of this. God just told him that they would believe him, right? God told him, "Say this and they will believe you." And he goes, "Well, what if they don't?"
Sorry, interrupt again. That said it was a German theologian who transliterated.
Yes. I have no idea what his name was. I don't remember. I read that and then I forgot it. And did he translate it for a king or did he translate it for a pope? I don't recall. Anyway, your dad might post that. The Lord...
Moses getting out.
Yeah. The Lord asked him, "What is that in your hand?" "A staff," he replied. Then he said, "Throw it on the ground." He threw it on the ground and it became a snake. Moses ran from it. But the Lord told him, "Stretch out your hand and grab it by the tail." So he stretched out his hand, caught it, and it became a staff in his hand. "This will take place," he continued, "so that they will believe that Yahweh, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you." More covenant flags, right? Now, that word causes problems, snake. Because, so God shows Moses this thing, hey, do this sign so that they'll believe you. Moses is going to do that later for Pharaoh's magicians, right? Only the word that's going to be used is not snake, or it's not translated as snake in all cases. In this instance, in Exodus 4, verse whatever we just read, that word is nachash, that gets translated as snake. This is the same word that gets translated as serpent in 3, 4. Satan, the devil, the serpent in the garden, right? So the word that's going to be used when Moses does this for the Egyptian magicians is tanin, which is often translated by the Greeks as dragon. So there's a little bit of literary and thematic irony that this thing that God has control over and puts under Moses' control to use as a sign, that the words used to describe it are dragon and serpent. And we've seen many times the theological baggage that comes with dragon in the Old Testament. The symbol for chaos, the symbol for evil, the symbol for everything working against God. And of course, the serpent, the original rebel, right? And both of those words kind of highly ironically get turned into a parlor trick at God's control in order to validate Moses. I think there's some intentional irony there. Okay, 6. In addition, the Lord said to him, "Put your hand inside your cloak." So he put his hand inside his cloak. When he took it out, His hand was diseased, white as snow. Your Bible might say leprous. Then he said, put your hand back inside your cloak. He put his hand back inside his cloak, and when he took it out, it had again become like the rest of his skin. If they will not believe you and will not respond to the evidence of the first sign, they may believe the evidence of the second sign. And if they don't believe even these two signs or listen to what you say, take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground. The water you take from the Nile will become blood on the ground. So all of these signs have something to do with judgment, right? The disease, the Nile water turning to blood is particularly pointed. The serpent / dragon snake thing, right? Notable chaos symbol. Disease, if you're translating that as leprous, notable symbol for divine judgment, right? The water from the Nile was considered like the water of life to the Egyptians. They knew that every year the Nile flooded, and when it flooded, it would spread fertile, silty soil on either sides of the Nile River. They called it the Black Land because of that soil, right? And that's what kept them able to grow enough food to stay a big, powerful empire, right? So turning the water that gave life to the empire into blood, that is a very theologically pointed symbol for people living in Egypt, right? So that's going to become a big thing. It's also a poke in the nose to the Pharaoh.
Yeah.
We haven't got into this. We will get into this. Spoilers. So Pharaoh was considered to be the literal embodiment of the gods, right? Specifically of, I don't remember which one. I believe it was Horus. But he was literally thought to be God, right? And it was Pharaoh's job to maintain the order of the cosmos. So if the Nile didn't flood, that was Pharaoh's fault, right? And if the Nile did flood every year as it was supposed to, they credited that to Pharaoh keeping the cosmos in correct order and balance as it should be, right? So for God to come and take that water and turn it to blood is like saying, so who's Pharaoh then? You think this is the guy that keeps the cosmos in order? Well, he can't do anything about this.
And do most pharaohs pass through lineage of family?
They were dynastic. Yeah,
Somebody like overtook them.
There were called intermediate periods between one dynastic line and another, where no single pharaoh had control. Sometimes you have multiple pharaohs, right? But yeah, generally it was dynastic. So the heir of the pharaoh would become the embodiment of their god when the previous one died, right? Okay. How far did we get? We got through verse 9, so we're on 10. All right. But Moses replied to the Lord, "Please, Lord, I have never been eloquent, either in the past or recently, or since you have been speaking to your servant, because I am slow and hesitant in speech." So this is now his third attempt to get out of having to do this. First he said, whoa, who am I? Right? And then he goes, but what if they don't believe me? And now he goes, but I can't talk well. Right?
I speak in no good.
Yeah. Yahweh said to him, "Who made the human mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf, seeing or blind? Is it not I, Yahweh? Now go, I will help you speak, and I will teach you what to say." Which is, he's basically told him word for word everything he's supposed to say, right? You tell them this.
Mm-hmm.
Moses said, "Please, Lord, send someone else." So now he's done making polite excuses, and he just said, "I don't want to do it. I want to do it. I want to do it. Send somebody else." Then the Lord's anger burned against Moses, and he said, "Isn't Aaron the Levite your brother? I know that he can speak well, and also he is on his way now to meet you. He will rejoice when he sees you. You will speak with him and tell him what to say. I will help both you and him to speak, and will teach you both what to say. He will speak to the people for you. He will be your spokesman, and you will serve as God to him. Take the staff in your hand, and you will perform this. Take the staff in your hand that you will perform the signs with." Okay, don't get hung up on verse 16, "and you will serve as God to him." That's just saying, in the same way that God tells Moses what to say, Moses is going to tell Aaron what to say. Moses is in no way deified by this whole thing, right? He's still just a guy.
I was going to ask at the end of 15, mine says, and we'll teach you both what to do. I guess it doesn't really matter, do versus say.
That is the end of 15, yeah.
Okay, you said say.
I probably just misspoke.
Okay. But it probably doesn't really matter.
Not really. 18. Then Moses went back to his father-in-law Jethro and said to him, "Please let me return to my relatives in Egypt and see if they are still living." Jethro said to Moses, "Go in peace." Now in Midian, slight timeout. Does this mean that God talked to Moses at the mountain of God and then later talked to him in Midian? Like there's two separate meetings? Yeah, it does seem to be that way, right? Do we have a specific exact chronology of that? No, we don't. We don't know if Moses asked Jethro, "Hey, I need to leave," like that same day, or if he asked him like 6 months later. It doesn't really say. Now in Midian, the Lord told Moses, "Return to Egypt, for all the men who wanted to kill you are dead." Okay. All of the men who wanted to kill Moses are dead. Who was specifically said to want to kill Moses in chapter 2? Pharaoh, right? It says Pharaoh sought to kill Moses. God is now saying everyone who wanted to kill you is dead. That means that the Pharaoh that was in charge while the Israelites were being oppressed and the Pharaoh that Moses is going to see now cannot possibly be the same guy. And I'm bringing that up because some internet arguments about this whole thing require that Pharaoh be the same guy in both cases. Mm-hmm. That doesn't work according to the text. Yeah. 20. So Moses took his wife and sons, he has 2 sons, put them on a donkey and returned to the land of Egypt, and Moses took God's staff in his hand. The Lord instructed Moses, "When you go back to Egypt, make sure you do all the wonders before Pharaoh that I have put within your power, but I will harden his heart so that he won't let the people go. Then you will..." Huh?
Which is weird.
Why is it weird?
I mean, I know before he mentioned that Pharaoh is not going to believe them,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't understand the hardening heart.
So there was a specific...
My sub thing says, "or will make him stubborn."
Right. So I'm going to read chapter 3, verse 19 and on a little bit. "However, I know that the king of Egypt will not allow you to go unless he is forced by a strong hand. I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my miracles that I will perform on it. After that, he will let you go." And okay. So in that case, God is saying he won't let you go. Later on in chapter 4, he's saying, "I will harden his heart." Mm-hmm. We're going to see as this whole story plays out that it's some of column A and some of column B, right? Mm-hmm. So is Pharaoh responsible for his decision to not let them go? Yes, he is. However, God is then going to use that decision to not let them go in order to make a specific point against Pharaoh and against Egypt. Because remember who Pharaoh is. He is a guy that's basically saying, "I am God. I maintain the cosmic order. I keep things functioning as they should. I am the one who is above everyone else," right? So that same attitude and that same sin gets referred to later on. Remember when we were in Exodus a few weeks ago, or not Exodus, Ezekiel. Why did I say it? I'm going to mix those up a lot of times. We're in Ezekiel a few weeks ago, and Ezekiel writes about Pharaoh with that kind of attitude in order to refer to Satan, who was guilty of the same thing. The same way he did with the king of Tyre, the same way he did with, I want to say, the king of Assyria. But that attitude of setting oneself up against God, right, That's part of what's at play here. So yeah, because of that, God is going to harden Pharaoh's heart. But that doesn't mean that Pharaoh was a softy who was about to let them go anyway, right? Pharaoh's going to have his chance. He's going to refuse. And then God is going to use that in order to glorify himself, but also crush the Egyptians and specifically Pharaoh.
I guess or making him stubborn
Yeah.
probably in English makes more sense.
I mean, it's a less clunky translation. I think what's important is that it's just consistent so that here it doesn't say stubborn and then later say hardened, right? But anyway, that's what's going on. Where did we get? I'm going to start at 21. The Lord instructed Moses, when you go back to Egypt, make sure you do all the wonders before Pharaoh that I have put within your power, but I will harden his heart so that he won't let the people go. Then you will say to Pharaoh, this is what Yahweh says. Israel is my firstborn son. I told you, let my son go so that he may worship me. But you refused to let him go. Now I will kill your firstborn son. Foreshadowing, right? We know how this is all going to go. We know that eventually this is going to lead to that Passover event where the firstborns of all of the non-faithful people die. But the Israelites will be spared. They will be passed over. Okay.
Okay. Before we get into the crazy we're about to get into, there's some debate of, I guess, the order of some of this that happened.
Yes.
I don't know if we want to mention that first.
The chronology here is not specific, right? Like exactly when God speaks to Moses, is this in a conversation they had before they left, while he was on the way? It's not stated, right? All we know is that this is something God said to Moses. There are times when the chronology that we're given in Exodus is out of order for a specific purpose, right? In this case, we're given some foreshadowing over the way the rest of the story is going to go. But remember, the chronology is not the most important thing to the author, right? Now, whether you believe the author is Moses or whether you believe that it was, edited by other people, we're not going to have that whole textual argument, right? Because either way, there's a theological message, an inspired one, and the theological message is what you're supposed to be getting out of this. The chronology is secondary. So whoever's writing this is feeling free to adjust that chronology to make the points they make. Now, we know at some point he's meeting with Aaron, who's on the way, right? Well, has Aaron been on the way since he was on the mountain? How much time has elapsed between here and when he was on the mountain? How long does it take for Aaron to get to there, right? We're not told.
He's not alone, so he's probably with a bunch of people.
We're not told any of that, right? This is why it's important to not get hung up on the chronology, because the chronology is not the point. The point is Aaron is not here right now, and that is about to become significant.
Right. And then before you go on, your mom said, interesting that one of the demonstrations for Moses to show Pharaoh was to turn his staff into a serpent representing Satan.
Yeah. Because who is in charge? Does Satan have power over God, or is it the other way around? I think there's intentional irony there. I really do. Okay, 24. On the trip, at an overnight campsite, it happened that the Lord confronted him and sought to put him to death. Okay, so Moses is traveling with his wife and 2 sons. Who is the him? It's not actually stated. It makes the most sense to think that this is Moses represented by the him, because Moses has been the center of the story for this entire book. It wouldn't make sense for all of a sudden some other person to be referred to here, right? But I will say that there's argument about this. Some people think that it's actually one of the kids. I don't think that's a great argument. Okay. So Zipporah, this is his wife, took a flint, cut off her son's foreskin, and touched it to Moses' feet. Then she said, "You are a bridegroom a bridegroom of blood to me. Now you might notice that I said touched it to his feet and not through it, because through it is a translation that doesn't make any sense, right? There's a little bit of an idiom going on here. We're going to start with the bridegroom of blood. That saying was part of the, part of the ritual of marriage for the Hebrews during this time. Because who were Hebrew women supposed to marry? Hebrew men. What was the sign signifying that somebody was a Hebrew man? Circumcision, right? So the phrase bridegroom of blood is associated with marriages between Hebrew women and Hebrew men. Does that make sense? We're starting there. So when she does this thing that apparently satisfies God, right? The words that she says that are associated with it are confirming that someone is a Hebrew of the covenant. Make sense? She's confirming by whatever she does that her husband is in fact a member of the covenant people. That is significant, right? Because we're not given the specific reason that God wanted to kill somebody. It doesn't say, right? You could speculate on whatever you wanted, but no matter what, it's an argument from silence, right? All we know is that whatever that reason was, what causes God to no longer want to do that is the fact that Zipporah circumcises her son and then does this symbolic thing identifying her husband as a member of the covenant. Does that make sense? So regardless of what the circumstance is, that's how the circumstance is resolved, is that a circumcision happens. And that begs lots of questions. And this keeps people awake at night.
We'll probably post that one video, not video chat, but
there is a podcast that I can post on this. It's in the weeds, I'll say that. But the gist of the argument is that it is possible that Moses was not correctly circumcised. The Egyptians did practice a form of circumcision that was not the same as the Israelite form, right? Mm-hmm. So was Moses a Hebrew? Yes, it is entirely possible, however, that his mother did not circumcise him the way that other Hebrews would have been circumcised, because she was trying to make him live, right? She sent him away hoping that he would live. It's possible that she wouldn't want to do something to him physically that would mark him as a Hebrew and lead to his death. It's also possible that by this time the Hebrews, because this is 400 years between when they arrived in Egypt and when the story starts, it's also possible that by this time the Hebrews in Egypt were doing the Egyptian form of circumcision, which wasn't the same. The Hebrew form of the circumcision was to remove the foreskin. The Egyptian form was to split the foreskin. I don't know what the point of that is. That's neither here nor there. So again, you have nothing but arguments from silence about that.
That's an argument from silence is dangerous ground.
It is. Which is why what we're sticking to is what resolves the issue is that Zipporah performs a circumcision on Moses' son and then says these words that identify her husband Moses as a man of the covenant, right? And the specific circumstances, there are some people that argue it one way and some people that argue it another. One way or another, that's how it came out, right? And people will go way off into the weeds and off their rocker trying to argue this way or that way, but that's how it resolves. Interestingly, she knows how to perform a circumcision. She is the one that resolves the problem. Moses is not, right? This also suggests that Aaron is not there yet, right?
Well, the interesting thing is that her son wasn't circumcised, and why wouldn't she have circumcised him already?
Maybe Moses had something to do with that. We don't know. Or maybe they did it a different way. Like, we don't know, right? It's just not said. But one way or another, the resolution is that she does this thing that normally would have been the role of a priest, right? And as a result of her doing this thing and identifying her husband ritually as a member of the covenant people, God is satisfied. Why would that matter? Well, because Moses is about to go to the Israelites and say, hey, remember that covenant? Remember that God? That's all happening now. We're going, right? God remembered the covenant. You're coming with me. We're going. He's going to lead you to the place that he promised to your forefathers. Oh, no, I'm not circumcised. Right? Or, oh, no, my sons, no, they're not circumcised. One way or another, whether the problem is Moses or whether the problem is Moses' sons or some combination of the two, one way or another, that is not an acceptable thing, right? Moses is going to be God's representative, God's leader for the covenant people. It's not acceptable for either Moses or his sons to not be part of that covenant the correct way. And it falls to Zipporah to fix it and to do this thing that normally would be the role of a priest. So that's how that whole thing went down.
We didn't read 26.
We didn't read 26? Okay. So he let him alone. At that time, she said, you are a bridegroom of blood, referring to the circumcision. Which is like we said, that's why it's associated with marriages. And we didn't really cover the feet thing. Feet is a common analogy or a common euphemism in ancient Hebrew texts for the genital region. So her saying that and applying the blood or piece to his genital region might have been the symbolic way of making that work out.
Because they definitely wouldn't have wanted to circumcise him.
Because then he would have an out. Right? He's been trying to get out of it. He's made 3 excuses and a flat refusal. All 3 excuses and the flat refusal, God shot down. He's not about to say, all right, I want you in Egypt now, but wait a few weeks. Like, that's not going to fly, right? Okay, 27. Now the Lord had said to Aaron, go and meet Moses in the wilderness. Now we had reference to that back in 3. So he went and met him at the mountain of God and kissed him. Moses told Aaron everything the Lord had sent him to say and about all the signs he had commanded him to do. Then Moses and Aaron went and assembled all the elders of the Israelites. Aaron repeated everything the Lord had said to Moses and performed all the signs for the people. The people believed, and when they heard that the Lord had paid attention to them, that they had seen their misery, or that he had seen their misery, they bowed down and worshipped. And that's where we're going to stop this for tonight. If you have any questions, feel free to post them in the Facebook group. We have a couple more minutes if anybody wants to type one out now. Questions or other comments, I guess. There's a lot of things that you can talk about in these chapters. There's a lot of things that people argue over, and it would take us hours and hours and hours to talk about the things that people argue over. And I'm not studied very well on every single facet of those. I have reviewed the arguments, and I know there's a lot of them.
I think one of the things I remember from that podcast was the talking about Moses was possibly supposed to meet Aaron there, but he decided to go and not wait for him and go to his father-in-law and then go ahead and head to Egypt.
It appears that way. That's one way that it can be read, right? Because God says Moses is on his way to meet you, right? Well, meet him where? Presumably with Jethro, but again, presumably.
And I guess I didn't say it here. Didn't Moses send back his wife and sons at some point? That's
going to get mentioned later. But yes, his wife and 2 sons are going to get sent back to his father-in-law, Jethro. Yeah.
For some reason, I thought it was like sooner.
Yeah. It's also significant to note that at this point, the leadership of the Israelites and the priestly role gets split, right? Because before this time, whoever was God's person that he had confirmed the covenant with, they were the representative for God, but also the one that interceded on behalf of the people, right? And you get a really good example of that in Abraham, because God is the leader of the people, or I'm sorry, Abraham is the leader of the people of God at that time, right? Although at that moment, it's just him and his family. But he's also the one that intercedes for Lot and tries to intercede for Sodom and Gomorrah, right? So same with Isaac and Jacob, and that role of leadership and intercessor is one person. But at Moses, it splits. The priestly role goes to Aaron and the leadership role goes to Moses. And it stays that way until, give you one guess. No. Jesus, right? Because Jesus is a king and a priest. He's the intercessor.
Sorry, I must have not heard the question.
This becomes a big deal in the New Testament in the book of Hebrews, right? And there's a comparison made to Melchizedek, which is a whole nother basket, bucket, dumpster of worms, right? But there's some people that argue that the splitting of the priestly and leadership roles was a concession to Moses' stubbornness. Well, like, fine, okay, you were going to be the head honcho in charge of priestly things and kingly things, but you whined and moaned and complained, so no, your brother's going to take half of it. Anyway, I will go ahead and shut off the stream here if anybody has any comments. I will go ahead and pray first. Let's pray real quick. Father, thank you again for the opportunity to study your word, to meet virtually as it is with other believers who are likewise interested in studying your word. Thank you that we get to also be part of your people, even though we weren't part of this original covenant. I brain farted on where I was going with that.
Bless you.
Amen. Bye. Have a good night.